So before we get too much into this content, I did want to recognize the fact that we know as a youth team that we've got people with very different perspectives on sexuality here in the crowd. So we've got grade 6s on one hand, we've got grade 12s on the other hand, and all in between. And many of you have varying perspectives or comfort levels or experiences when it comes to sexuality. And that's totally fine. We know that for a lot of our junior highs in the room, sexuality is not going to be something that you've talked much about, but we also recognize that this is a really, really important conversation. We also recognize that there might be people in the room who sexuality never really interests them, even into adulthood, and that's totally fine. Paul, the guy who wrote a lot of the New Testament, he was single. He talked about his singleness. He even wished that more people would be single because of how much he appreciated it for his ministry. But he also recognized that God created people to be different. And so when it came to sexuality, there were going to be differences in single people and married people and that type of thing. And so, again, that doesn't mean that we're going to shy away from talking about sexuality. We think it's important for all people to have this discussion. And like Olivia mentioned last week, we recognize that the church has not always done the best job in kind of fostering an environment where it's okay to talk about sexuality. Because it hasn't always been a safe place to talk about these things, a lot of people have carried some hurt on this topic of sexuality, and we don't want this to be one of those places. We really believe that the church should be an important place and a safe place for us to be able to talk about sexuality. I know in my perspective, I really only heard about this topic from my peers, whether it was at school or on my baseball team, and their perspectives on sexuality were often very dangerous and damaging. Our churches and our homes need to be the safest place that we can talk through these confusing and really important issues. And so as you have questions kind of come up within the next days and weeks and months, we really want you, when you're ready to ask those questions, to just do it, just to ask those questions. Find a safe person and ask. Don't hold them in like I did even until my early 20s. Now, on the topic of kind of safe people to talk about these things, that leads me to an important note about the role our parents play when it comes to this discussion. I hope and I pray that your homes are places that are safe to talk about this topic. Many of your parents really want to be a part of this journey in discovering and learning truth surrounding sexuality, and I think that's an amazing thing. One of our hopes is that your parents feel equipped to have these conversations with you. My parents are incredible people, but I don't think they always felt equipped or even resourced to know how to talk about sexuality with me. And I know that respect was a really important thing for them, but when it came to sexuality, I really had to discover a lot of what I know on my own. And like I said, when you're learning those things from your peer groups, my friends at school, my baseball teams, that can be really difficult. And it can lead to a lot of hurt and confusion like it did for me, even going into my marriage when I was 22. So I really want you to embrace safe people. And I really hope and pray that your parents are those safe and safe people to you. So as you may have noticed, I'm using this term sexuality a lot. And hopefully by the end of this talk, the word sexuality, if it is a little bit awkward for you, it'll be less awkward and it will be less uncomfortable for you to hear that word. Because as we discover tonight, we're going to see this term as really, really important. And the definition leads to the core of what we're going to be talking about. I know that as early as grade 5, many of you have been learning about sexuality in your health classes at school. And so our goal is to take that understanding that you have of sexuality and frame it in a very biblical way. Olivia mentioned this last week, but at the end of the day, God needs to come first when it comes to discussing these topics. That wasn't the case for me that I developed in junior high and high school. When I was learning about sexuality from my peers, God wasn't a part of their worldview, and so there was no way that they were going to filter their understanding of sexuality through a godly lens. But our aim is to do just that. We want to take our worldview and our understanding of God, and we want to filter what sexuality is through that lens. So let's quickly talk about what sexuality is for those of you who might already be confused about what we're talking about. I found this definition on a website called Better Health out of Australia, and I really liked the way that they framed it. They said that sexuality is about your sexual feelings, thoughts, attractions, and behaviors towards other people. You can find other people physically, sexually, or emotionally attractive, and all of those things are part of your sexuality. So there are a few key things here that we need to look at. First, your sexual feelings, your sexual thoughts, your sexual attractions, and your sexual behaviors. And then finding people physically, sexually, and emotionally attractive. That gives us the basis of what we're going to be talking about tonight in terms of sexuality. And we know that the Bible actually has a ton to say about this topic and about sexuality. And it's our understanding of Scripture that we can see both healthy sexuality and unhealthy sexuality. So we're only going to have one little discussion break here tonight, but what I want you to do is take 3 minutes and talk through moments in Scripture that you've seen talk about sexuality. So maybe it's books of the Bible, maybe it's specific passages, but what are some of those things that you've seen specifically in the Bible discuss that idea of sexuality? So you've got 3 minutes, go ahead. Excellent. I hope you had a great 3 minutes of discussion. It was my intention for you to kind of think through some of these books and passages of the Bible because I thought of kind of two different things here. The first thing is that we recognize throughout all the books of the Bible, from Genesis all the way to the end of the Bible, that sexuality is not something that's shied away from by the authors. They're constantly talking about sexuality and giving us this idea of what healthy sexuality looks like. But I don't know, for the second thing, I don't know if you noticed this. This is something that I thought was really interesting, but in the whole New Testament, what we see is a framing of an understanding of unhealthy sexuality. So the authors of the New Testament are constantly, and a lot of it's Paul, constantly talking through what it means to have an unhealthy sexuality, because the beginning of the Bible, the Old Testament, is giving us a better understanding of what it means to have healthy sexuality. In the New Testament, we see these moments of correction of people in the church who had these sexual feelings, thoughts, attractions, and behaviors that led them further away from God rather than towards God. What we do see, however, is a book of the Bible that many of you likely brought up in your discussion, the Song of Songs. And it's an incredible example of what healthy sexuality looks like. If you've ever read this book of the Bible, you know just how intimate it really can be. Song of Songs is a great example to this kind of question we sometimes ask ourselves of whether or not sexuality is a bad thing. It's absolutely not a bad thing. Solomon's intimate thoughts written down in the Bible are there for a reason, and it's an example of how healthy sexuality can look like and can be modeled. Listen to these words in Song of Songs, chapter 4, starting at verse 9. It says, "You have captured my heart, my treasure, my bride. You hold it hostage, and with one glance of your eyes, with a single jewel on your necklace. Your love delights me, my treasure, my bride. Your love is better than wine, your perfume more fragrant than spices." In terms of sexuality, Solomon is demonstrating his sexual feelings, thoughts, attractions, and behaviors towards his wife in a very healthy way. On the flip side, again, going back to the New Testament, we see all sorts of references to sexual immorality or unhealthy sexuality in a number of books, like I mentioned. I could list off dozens of passages that talk about unhealthy sexuality, but here are just a few as an example. In Ephesians, Paul knew that the church of Ephesus was experiencing challenges in a number of different areas, and so he reminded them by saying, "Let there be no sexual immorality, impurity, or greed among you. Such sins have no place among God's people." That's Ephesians 5:3. And then in 1 Corinthians, Paul reminds the church of Corinth about this group of people who had no reverence for what God's intentions were when it came to sexuality, and he said this, "And we must not engage in sexual immorality as some of them did," talking about this group of people. That's in 1 Corinthians 10:8. And then finally, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, we see Paul remind the church of Thessalonica of something that exists at the core of why we're having this discussion today. Here's what it says. "God's will for you is to be holy, so stay away from all sexual sin. Then each of you will control his own body and live in holiness and honor, not in lustful passion like the pagans who do not know God and his ways." Now, again, there's two really important things that we're seeing in this passage, and one of these things I think really ties together why we're having this discussion in the first place. First thing is that Paul addresses lust in this passage. Lust is what happens when our sexuality becomes unhealthy and outside of the way that God intends it to exist. When our sexual feelings, thoughts, attractions, and behaviors become ungodly, it becomes lust, and it's something that we're called to avoid. This is something that at some point or another in our lives, regardless of age, gender, life stage, etc., these are things we're going to deal with. Lust is something that we're going to deal with. Secondly, we see in this passage that God calls us to be holy. And this is really, really important for us to look at. If you're not aware of the meaning of the term holy, it basically means to be set apart. Ultimately, the pagans that Paul's referring to were people that didn't have the same thoughts on sexuality as God does. And we experience that a lot in our society today, where people don't see sexuality in the same light as we do as Christ followers. Again, talking about that idea of worldview and the way that we have kind of this godly lens that we're looking through towards all the things that we see. The truth is, like anything else in our faith, we're not always going to hit the mark that God has set for us. But that's where God's grace comes in. When we mess up and our sexuality is outside of what God intends it to be, we have to accept his grace and then reorient our sexuality back from an unhealthy sexuality towards God's intended healthy sexuality. Healthy sexuality is something that's seen throughout Scripture as something that's really, really important to God. We're created to be sexual beings who have sexual feelings, thoughts, attractions, and behaviors, and that's okay. That's healthy. In putting together this content for this month of dating, sexuality, and sex, we recognized this topic to be a really, really important one. Again, we want to open up kind of levels of conversation, knowing that it's okay to talk about these things in church, knowing that it's okay to talk about these things in our homes. We knew that this is not something that we could take lightly, but something that we needed to put a lot of heart and a lot of effort into, and a lot of prayer into it as well. This needs to be a conversation that we can reorient from what our society tells us sexuality is to what God intends for it. At Youth, our goal is to create a space where you can feel comfortable sharing your concerns and your questions and your confusion. At church, it can be really difficult for people to ask their sensitive and personal questions about sex and same-sex attraction because we know that people can be really afraid in admitting when they're struggling with an issue in this area, thinking that the church is just going to push them away. Our goal is for you to know that we're available and we're open to listening with love. We want you to know that regardless, again, of that kind of comfort level or of that, experience level, that you might deal with a lot of confusing kind of feelings and a lot of confusing things going on in your life, and that's completely normal, and it's something we want to talk about. Ultimately, we want you to be talking about this with your parents or finding a mentor that you trust to walk through with many of these confusing feelings. But we want you to find spaces that you're safe to talk freely and honestly. This is a huge topic that we're dealing with tonight. And again, we know that it's not an easy thing to talk about. But like we've mentioned here, Scripture talks about it. It's healthy, it's a safe thing to talk about, and we want you to know that the church is ready to talk about these issues, and that, again, we are ready to equip you and equip your parents in knowing how to talk about these things in a safe and healthy manner. So thanks so much for listening to this kind of talk. I want to end with a moment of prayer, and then I'm going to send you to your small groups. God, thanks so much for the students that are sitting in this room tonight, listening to this topic of sexuality. God, I know that there's probably a lot going through their minds, and I also recognize that there's a lot of varying perspectives on this idea. And so, God, I ask that, first of all, that you would be in control of our conversations going forward. God, that you would be present in all the things that we say with one another, and God, that you would protect us. God, thank you for the love that you have for sexuality and the way that you've created us to be sexual beings. And God, we just really desire for our understanding of sexuality to come from you and you alone. God, that our understanding of sexuality wouldn't come from culture and society, but God, that we would have a very healthy view and a view that we get from Scripture and from your character and who you've created us to be, and seeing that. And so, God, we're grateful for Scripture, and we're grateful for the chance that we have to explore that even further. So we ask all these things in your name. Amen.